Okay, thank you. How much time do I have?
Yeah, about half an hour or so. Or 20
Okay.
minutes, half an hour.
So I will try to be quick because
Up to
I
you,
thought
yeah.
I had a bit more time, but
Yeah, I mean, so for the lecture,
Yeah,
then
for-
there's 10
oh,
minutes,
okay.
15 minutes for Q&A.
okay, perfect. So I will try to be as concise as possible. So I will not hold people for before lunch, which is not nice. But so thank you for being here. And today I'm going to talk about the insanity defense and why it is so difficult to apply to cases of crimes committed by extreme religious believers, and in particular by extreme religious believers who belong to a religious organization, call it a cult or a sect or whatever. So before doing that, I will just present myself briefly. So my name is Eugenia, and I'm a postdoctoral researcher in this project called Resilient Beliefs, Religion and Beyond, which is based at the Fondazione Bruno Kessler in Trento, in Italy. And the goal of our project is to try to better understand the nature of resilient beliefs and of religious beliefs in particular, especially from an epistemic standpoint. So understand whether they are more similar to conspiracy theories or delusions, or to the convictions of scientists in their own scientific theory, or if they are a category on their own. So this is our team. So I work with these really nice people, and if you want to know more, just Google resilientbeliefs.fbk.eu or drop me an email. So moving to my talk, so the main argument that I want to present here today is that the difficulty in the application of the insanity defense to crimes committed by extreme religious believers shows an inadequacy in our epistemic understanding of what is a pathological religious belief, especially when this belief is shared by people belonging to an organized group, so a cult, a sect, etc. What I mean by extreme religious beliefs is simply religious beliefs that have harmful consequences for their beholders and or for other people. The insanity defense is a law that is present in most Western legislations, and it aims to protect the rights of people who suffer from mental disorders but who commit crimes. And it comprises two clauses, a mental illness clause and an incapacity clause. So the mental illness clause states that a defendant, in order to be found not guilty for reasons of insanity, must suffer from a severe mental disease or defect that affected him or her at the time of the crime. And the incapacity clause additionally states that in order for a defendant to be found not guilty for reasons of insanity, as a result of this severe mental defect, the defendant must have been unable to appreciate the quality and nature or the wrongfulness of his actions at the time of the crime. And by wrongfulness, the law refers to objective, societal, or public standards of moral wrongfulness, not the defendant's subjective personal standards. So there are some interesting facts about the insanity defense. The first is that, contrary to a part of popular opinion, it's rarely used. The second is that when it's used, it's rarely successful. And the third is that even more so, it's rarely, especially rarely successful for crimes committed by extreme religious believers who belong to religious groups. So in their study, Holoida and Newman show that in the United States, whenever the insanity defense was raised as a consequence of crimes committed by extreme religious believers who belong to an organized religious group, it was never successful. So that tells a lot. So let's compare these two cases just to give you a better idea of what I'm talking about. The case of Andrea Yates on the one hand and the case of Jacques Robidoux on the other hand. So Andrea Yates drowned her children because she believed that if they kept living, they would have been tormented and go to hell. And she was acquitted on reasons of insanity. While Jacques Robidoux, his father was the leader of a religious sect, the Gatekeepers, that believed that many institutions, including the United States medical system, were Satan's 7 counterfeit systems. And he had a son. After some months after the birth of his son, one of his sisters claimed to receive a revelation from God that the baby should just be breastfed and not be given other food. And unfortunately, the baby deteriorated, but it was not taken to hospital until eventually died of malnourishment. And contrary to Andrea Yates, together with his wife, he was convicted of first-degree murder. And so, despite the similarity of beliefs between Andrea Yates and Jacques Robidoux, they were treated very, very differently by the law. And I believe this happened for 2 reasons. So the first reason is that there is, and the first reason, so not only explains, doesn't really explain why the 2 cases were treated differently, but it explains more why it's difficult to apply the insanity defense to cases of crimes committed by religious believers. And the reason is that there is a tension in the legal systems between a law of responsibility that recognizes that culpability for one's voluntary actions may be assigned based on one's reasoning or lack of capacity of reasoning for those actions, and the law that grants freedom of religion. And the law that grants freedom of religion, as Lim says, not only recognizes but even celebrates that people may accede to religious faith without particularly having to engage in reasoning, whether or not they might be capable of doing so. And this is restated by some trials and sentences, like United States versus Ballard, that says that man was granted the right to worship as he pleased and to answer to no man for the verity of his religious views. So, of course, granting freedom of belief is not the same as granting freedom of action, but I believe that the very fact that the law concedes the right to people to embrace religious beliefs without having to engage with alternative reasoning, or even without having the capacity to engage with alternative reasoning, should cast doubt on the ability and capacity of these people to entertain beliefs with reason, to have the capacity of reasoning, and should they commit a crime, to be held accountable for these crimes. So this is the reason that explain why it's difficult to apply the insanity defense to crimes committed by religious believers. But there is a second reason, I believe, why it's especially difficult to apply the insanity defense to crimes committed by extreme religious believers who belong to a religious group. And this reason is that non-pathological religious beliefs and pathological religious beliefs are hard to tell apart from an epistemic standpoint, especially when these beliefs are shared by a group or a community. So the question becomes how to distinguish religious beliefs from, so non-pathological religious beliefs from pathological religious beliefs. And I will take the case of delusions that are held to be pathological beliefs par excellence, and also because during my PhD I focused on delusions, so here I am again. So a delusion is defined as a fixed belief based on incorrect inference about external reality that is firmly sustained despite what almost everyone else believes, and despite what constitutes incontrovertible and obvious proof or evidence to the contrary. The belief is not one ordinarily accepted by other members of the person's culture or subculture, so it's not an article of religious faith. So this is the definition of delusions given by the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which is, let's say, the Bible of psychiatry. And so there are different approaches have been put forward to distinguish pathological religious beliefs from non-pathological religious beliefs, or even more broadly, pathological beliefs from non-pathological beliefs. And the first approach is what I call the idiosyncrasy approach, which is the one put forward by the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which can be summarized in this sentence. Contrary to religious delusions, extreme religious beliefs are not pathological because they are shared by a community or by other people. But there are exceptions to this statement, to this assumption, that are also widely recognized by psychiatry. And this is the case of shared delusions, which are also called folie à deux or à trois, depending on the number of people involved in these group delusions. And for example, there's this case of three sisters in the US who were charged with assault and battery with intent to kill, but were later found to be not guilty for reasons of insanity because their actions were guided by delusional belief with religious content. And the three sisters began to live together because Sister 1 was worried that harm would have come to her children at the hands of her mother, who suffered from schizophrenia. However, after some days, the three sisters started living on their own in a house nearby, following the suggestion of the husband of Sister 1. And after some time, Sister 2 started believing that God had special plans for her and her sisters, which involved taking hold of their neighbor's house. And the other two sisters started believing that so they assaulted basically the neighbor, but they were found not guilty for reasons of insanity because they said it was a case of shared delusions. So Sister 1 started developing a delusional belief, and it managed to let's say, spread as a kind of infection to the other two sisters. So this first approach doesn't seem very successful in distinguishing pathological religious beliefs from non-pathological religious beliefs. So let's try with another popular approach to distinguish the two, which is what I call the roots approach. So that states that contrary to religious delusions, extreme religious beliefs are not pathological because they do not originate from a biological or a neurological dysfunction. And this approach is quite popular, but it has strong counterexamples. Again, think about cases of post-traumatic stress disorders and dissociative identity disorders that are recognized as mental disorders, but they don't have a neurobiological or biological origin. They just have a purely environmental origin. So again, this approach to distinguish the two phenomena seems to fail. So let's try with a third approach, which is the fruits approach, what I call the fruits approach, which was famously proposed by William James, who focused especially on religious beliefs and on pathological religious beliefs, trying to distinguish, as I'm trying to do now, religious delusions from authentic religious experience and authentic religious belief. So according to James, what distinguishes normal from pathological religious beliefs is the fruits or consequences that these beliefs have, not the way they are generated. So basically, if the religious belief has positive consequences for the beholder, then it doesn't count as pathological. If it has negative consequences, it counts as pathological. So what I like about this approach is that it can be useful in the case where there is a self-destructive component of the religious belief. And I also like the fact that it acknowledges that delusional beliefs are not always pathological, but they can also have a protective or even adaptive role. And in this case, as I've argued in a paper with Lisa Bortolotti, delusions are not pathological, but a response to an already existing problem. What I'm less convinced about this approach is that non-pathological beliefs can also negatively impact life. So it can be that the pathology of a belief or of a mental state is entirely subjective, but I'm not sure. I don't know. Another interesting approach to distinguish between pathological religious beliefs and non-pathological religious beliefs is what I call the phenomenological embodied approach. So there are three main points that, according to this approach, would distinguish these two phenomena. In the case of religious delusions, language would be used in a concrete and non-metaphorical manner, while this would not be the case for religious beliefs. So, for example, when people with delusions say that they feel God inside them, they usually refer to a precise physical sensation, while this is not usually the case for people who don't suffer from delusions, that they use religious language in a more metaphorical way. And the second point that distinguish religious delusions from that would distinguish religious delusions from religious beliefs is that usually people who suffer from religious delusions think that they hold a privileged relationship with the divine, while in the case of believers belonging to a religious community, the relationship with the divine is usually equal, at least among members of the same community. So I quite like the language point, but I kind of agree on the privileged relationship with the divine point, but more in the case of individual delusions, so delusions that are not shared by other people, because again we have the problem: if a group of people believes they are the chosen, be them more than 2, 3 or more, does this make them less pathological? And again we go back to the Three Sisters case that I mentioned earlier. And then the last approach that has been proposed to distinguish between pathological religious beliefs and non-pathological religious beliefs is what I call the incapacity to grasp alternative arguments approach, which would state that contrary to religiously deluded people, extreme religious believers, so this is more about the believers than the beliefs themselves, is that extreme religious believers are sane because they do not lack the capacity to engage with and in alternative reasoning. So I believe this is not true. Empirical evidence shows that it's not true that that people with delusions lack the capacity of engaging with alternative reasoning, because cognitive behavioral therapy works in the case of many delusions, and if people lacked the capacity to engage with alternative reasoning, CBT wouldn't work. Also, people with delusions usually make an effort to incorporate contrary evidence, for example, by stating that they are an exception to general rules or by confabulating complex stories that explain away the evidence. They wouldn't need to do so if they lack the capacity to engage with alternative reasoning. And also some patients, especially those suffering from grandiose delusions tend to avoid contrary evidence in order to not disconfirm their delusions. So I think that the account is saying that the people with delusions lack the capacity to engage in alternative reasoning is imprecise. It would be better to say that people with delusions make more effort to exercise the capacity to engage with alternative reasoning. And this would be due to some factors, such as the presence of anomalous perceptions, especially in some kinds of delusions, the ones involving hallucinations as well, and for the presence of cognitive biases and motivated reasoning. I'm more persuaded by, I think that if we focus just on the cognitive biases and motivated reasoning, again, we have a problem, because these phenomena do not just belong to people with delusions, but also to people without delusions. So many people, including us, suffer from cognitive biases and motivated reasoning of a various kind. So again, it works better for if people with if there is a strong presence of hallucinations or other psychotic symptoms. So the conclusions is that the difficulty in applying the insanity defense to crimes committed by extreme religious believers shows that our understanding of what is a pathological belief or a delusion should be refined, especially when it comes to beliefs shared by religious groups. And this is to protect the rights of people suffering from mental disorders, of course. This doesn't mean that it's easy to refine these tools. I think that the definition of delusion could be enriched, at least in the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual of Mental Disorders, and this has been proposed by many people. So we could say that a delusion is a fixed belief that is resistant to counter evidence. It can occasionally be shared by other people. So usually delusions are idiosyncratic beliefs, but not always, as we've seen. It usually has detrimental consequences for its beholder. And some kinds of delusions, especially those accompanied by anomalous perceptions, such as hallucinations, are characterized by a non-metaphorical use of language. And finally, people suffering from delusions make more effort to engage with alternative reasoning. So they do not lack the capacity, but they make more effort to exercise this capacity. And I think that this conclusion is far from being conclusive, but at least it pays more justice to complex phenomena such as delusional beliefs, and especially to people who suffer from mental disorders and who might be excluded by the insanity defense. Thanks.